Mike's on Mike, a conversation about politics, government, and Jacksonville, with 50-year opinion leaders Mike Hightower, Mike Tolbert, and award-winning broadcaster and longtime political observer, Mike Miller.
Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Mike's on Mike. Mike Hightower is here with us. Unfortunately, Mike Tolbert is not. We've had some terrible technical difficulties in being able to bring him up from his farm over there in Central Florida, but I think a cow might have stepped on the Wi-Fi or something like that. I'm not sure. But
the squirrel died and on the wheel.
But we apologize to him, and we apologize to the vast audience that we have to this program that he's not with us, but we are here, and we're happy to have him. And perhaps because of all of the talk that we have done in efforts to restore the Laura Street Trio, some of the Jacksonville's history has been front and center lately. And as a result, the city's history has always been front and center for today's guest. Our guest today is Dr. Alan Bliss, CEO of the Jacksonville Historical Society. You know his name, of course, because we mention it every show.
And we so appreciate that.
And being the sole sponsor of Mike's on Mike, and we do appreciate it. Dr. Bliss received his PhD from the University of Florida and taught at UNF before being named JHS CEO in 2018, replacing longtime director Emily Liska, who retired. Perhaps most importantly, Dr. Bliss is the reason why the Jacksonville Historical Society and the Jacksonville History Center sponsors Mike on Mike, and we're very grateful for that. Alan, thank you very, very much.
Thanks
for
to you
being
guys.
here and for being a sponsor.
Grateful to be here.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for the invitation.
First of all, even though we mention the Historical Society and the History Center at every podcast, can you tell us what it is that you guys actually do?
So, well, you said it right. History is front and center for me, and I think it should be front and center for everybody in Jacksonville.
Amen.
The history of a place, wherever you are, if it's your home, the block you live on, your neighborhood, your city, your state, your country, the more you know about that, the more you become invested in that place, the more of a sense of ownership that you have in it. And the greater that develops, then the greater your sense of citizenship, and that leads to a concern about the future of that place. And that's why I argue that paying attention to history, knowing something about the past, the people and the events of the place that you live, that strengthens citizenship. And so history is not just about looking back over our shoulder at the past. It's not just about touchy-feely nostalgia. It's about an investment in the future. So our mission statement is strengthening citizenship through public history education. That's our value proposition. And Jacksonville's history really matters because this is a great city. It is the largest city in Florida in terms of size and population. It is the oldest of any of the significant cities in Florida. It is bigger and older than any of our peer cities. And when I say peer cities, I mean Tampa, Orlando, Miami, and to a certain extent, St. Petersburg. There has been more and more interesting history in Jacksonville than any of the rest of those places. And we just have an incredible amount of good, honest work to do. We always have. And, since we keep making more history, hey, it's job security for me.
I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but you're right.
Yeah. But, on that part, Alan, you make a good point, because when you think over the last 10 or 15 years, how Jacksonville's population has grown, not so much from within, but people who are moving here. If they don't have a sense of what Jacksonville was, then how do they know where they want to go? And I think that's really important. As a former civics teacher who taught in this town, was a history major, I think it becomes even more vital, particularly if we want them to make a contribution and take us to the next level, particularly if they don't know where we came from, what started it, why were we the largest city, other than maybe Key West at one point, which was full of pirates. But Jacksonville's always been the key city here, correct?
Yeah, and I mean, certainly for the last 200 years. I mean, with due respect to our neighbors to the south in St. Augustine, who claim 1565 as their foundational moment, and Fernandina to the north, also an old place, Pensacola old. But really, over the past 200 years, no city has really crammed as much and as much importance into its role in the state and regional economy and the political life and the civic life of Florida as Jacksonville has. But what you were just alluding to, Mike Hightower, brings up a question that I find myself having a lot of conversations with people around town about, and that is Jacksonville's identity, its civic identity, its municipal brand. Our peer cities that I just mentioned have cultivated a brand and an identity, and I often hear it lamented that Jacksonville lacks the strength of identity that our peer cities do. Tampa has associated itself with a legacy of piracy, totally made up. There were never any pirates down there, but that's their brand anyway.
Works for them.
And Orlando has associated itself with the Magic Kingdom and tourism and sophisticated 21st century visitation. Miami has branded itself as this extraordinarily multicultural place, gateway to the Caribbean and South America, and just a remarkably diverse pastiche of humanity. What's Jacksonville's identity? And I'd be interested in hearing the Mikes venture some thoughts about that.
No, we're here to talk about you. I'm going to do this. If you had a blank sheet of paper, given that your accountability responsibility is history, what is it? What would you think, given everything that you said we have been? What do you think we should? What would be? Give us 2 or 3. What we should build on.
When I talk to people you mentioned people who have just moved to town, right?
Correct.
When I talk to people who are newcomers, they arrive with I think, a misapprehension or a misunderstanding about what the city is. They see it as one-dimensional. They see it as racially and ethnically homogenous. They see it as culturally indifferent. They see it as politically sort of also homogenous and somewhat retrograde. They see it as lacking in economic heft. And the longer people are here, when they relocate here from someplace else, the more they realize that almost none of that is true.
Correct.
And so I think the story is that this is a place of surprising complexity. Now, there are a couple of things that we can say are enduring brand characteristics. This is a river city and a seaport town. It has always been important to international commerce. It's one of the things that makes it demographically complex. People have been emigrating to Jacksonville from all over the world since the 19th century. So it's complicated in that way. It's a Navy town. It has always been a center, and for much of the 20th century, the center of banking and insurance and commerce generally certainly throughout the state of Florida. It has been the center of political gravity for much of the 20th century. Some would argue that it continues to carry a lot of weight. Some would say that it's in ascendance again. If so, I'd say that's about time, and that's something that the Mikes can speak to a little bit more. I think the river, the seaport, the Navy, it is increasingly now a center for the healthcare industry, health sciences. One thing that it has in common with our peer cities, and this is something that one of my board members, J.F. Bryan, often laments, is that it used to be a city of corporate headquarters.
Yeah.
And that's no longer so true since banking and insurance companies have been subsumed by larger nationals and their headquarters moved elsewhere. But isn't that true of Tampa and Orlando and Miami as well? I mean, can you think of a major banking organization that's headquartered anymore in any of those cities, a statewide corporation? Yeah. In Jacksonville, the largest financial institution that's based here now is ViStar Credit Union.
By the way, who is making an incredible positive impact on this community.
Are they not? Yeah.
I mean, they're just, what Brian has done is taken that to the next level.
They walk the walk.
They really do. In every way, what they're doing. Interesting. You did mention Jaguars.
NFL franchises and Major League Baseball franchises are by their very nature at the core of the civic identity of every city where there is one. So, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers shrewdly, when former Jacksonville businessman Hugh Culbreth won that NFL franchise back in the 1970s. He saw to it that the name, the Buccaneers, was associated with Tampa's sort of civic and cultural identity. But major league teams really they step into an identity role. And that's the whole point. I mean, that's why in the early 20th century, businessmen, civic entrepreneurs, and they were all pretty much men at the time, they invested in athletic franchises because they wanted to find a way to help draw the community, the population, all the people of a city into some sort of civic identity and collective sort of civic pride.
Yeah.
Does Jacksonville really need that? I'm not sure. Somebody very shrewdly observed to me at a conversation on this subject not long ago that the Jaguars are important to Jacksonville's identity, sure, but they say, it's like the Jaguars got here in the 1990s and they sort of stepped into an identity vacuum in Jacksonville, that there was not anything for them to compete with. And so it was easy for the teal colors and the Jags logo and the name and the chant, all of that. It was easy for that to sort of take on an outsized role in civic identity. But man, it just seems like this place is a lot more than Major League Athletics.
Yeah. Real quick, during that time that I had the opportunity to be part of the chamber, chaired it, is you made the comment about people coming here, the misconception or why did I get sick? When was the last time you heard somebody say, I want to U-Haul it and leave Jacksonville? It is, and my wife hates it when I say this, it's a very seductive town. To me, that is the essence. I think that's the real secret of how we take that. And I know that's a terrible word to use probably in this day and age, but I'm from the old school. But you talk to people, and once they get here, it's a very inclusive town. When you think of the number of nonprofits that are here, it's small. I can remember the year that I chaired the Chamber of Commerce. We were at over 4,000 members, and 93.7% of the chamber's membership was made up of employers of 25 employees or less.
Isn't that interesting? And did you ever dive into the demographics about how many of them were Jacksonville natives as opposed to people who had relocated here?
No, we never did. But it is really, you really make a unique point about the entrepreneur. That is really one of the essence of this town is small business. When you really look at the number, we don't have any we have big buildings, but they're not filled. Big Florida Blues, big building is now going to go to the police. But when you look at it, it's a place where people can come here, get involved, and move up the ladder civically, politically, or professionally. That's my perspective.
I think so. I feel welcomed here. I have since the very beginning, and I've made it a point to pay that forward and make sure that I make people feel welcome as I meet them. I feel lucky to be here and feel kind of like I fell backwards into this. I was hired to teach at the University of North Florida, and I really already understood that Jacksonville was a complicated place. It had featured in some of my graduate research, so I wasn't parachuting into alien territory.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the historical issues that Jacksonville's facing now.
Now you've talked about, maybe this is a good thing to talk about some of the issues we're confronted with.
Obviously, one that keeps getting into the headlines is the monument removals. I have a copy here, and folks, you ought to look it up online. It's very interesting. This is Dean Black. His legislation that he has introduced, along with a couple of amendments, have come, and there's now a state senator who has a companion bill over in the Senate. And all of this, they're calling part of the historic preservation legislation is what they're talking about. But it's really a lot deeper than that, much deeper than that. First of all, one of the things that I'd asked is, they talk about these being Civil War monuments and historical monuments. What makes them historic? We talk about the Confederacy, and it's like, well, wait a minute. There was no war here between 1961 and 1965. Guys, we were not a part of that.
Jacksonville, unlike most of the rest of the significant cities of the states of the former Confederacy, was not the scene of any significant combat.
I always say Olustee is the closest, I believe.
Olustee is the closest. The riverine commerce, probably most noted by the torpedoing, the mining of the steamboat Maple Leaf, a Union Army vessel that was operating in the St. Johns River. The city itself was, for most of the Civil War, a Union Army garrison town. The Union soldiers were forced to flee a couple of times, but there was no significant combat here. When the Union naval forces advanced up the St. Johns River, the locals, such as former Florida Governor Napoleon Bonaparte Broward and his brother Montcalm Broward, observed the advancing Union forces, and they strategically retreated further and further upriver and eventually retreated and repaired to points west. I think they took up residence for most of the war at a relative's property out in Madison County. So Jacksonville isn't Savannah. It isn't Atlanta. It isn't Birmingham. It isn't the places that Mobile. It isn't the places that experienced Civil War conflict.
So where did we get all of this historic relevance?
It appears, well, here, let's clarify our terms a little bit.
Yeah.
I do not know Representative Black. If I've ever met him, I'm not remembering it. But I understand what I understand from his intent as he has expressed it, and as people who are advocates of his legislation express it. They seek to defend history, as they put it. And as a history professional, that, of course, is music to my ears. I'm always delighted when people declare their willingness to stand up for history. But there's a difference between history and what happened in the past. The past is the people and the events of the time that has gone before. That isn't history. History is the discipline, the process by which we study and understand and interpret and explain the people and events of the past. And when someone asserts that they are defending history, I think it's all too common for them to get those two things conflated. If you're defending the events and the people of the past, that's one thing. But if you're defending an explanation or an interpretation of the events of the past, give up, forget about it, because that is always changing, and it always will. Those interpretations continue to tumble out, and that happens because of a couple of things. We learn more things about the people and events of the past. Evidence continues to develop through the archival record, through the anecdotes, the recollections. That's one dimension. Another dimension is that the consequences of the things that happened in the past continue to tumble out. We know more about the consequences of, for example, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. In the months and the years immediately following the assassination, of course, a political and cultural tragedy for the United States, but it's only in the decades that have come since then that we've come to realize all the different roads not taken as a result of that big change in the presidential administration that really rose out of just 3 gunshots in Dallas, Texas on a Friday afternoon in 1963. That's history. The assassination, the events, the people, that's the past. History we're continuing to unpack and change. And so an assertion that by insisting that a building, a statue, a monument, a bridge, a street, whatever it is, by insisting that it remains static and unchanged, that one is defending history, is just a misunderstanding of what history really is.
Wow.
What role should the Historical Society and the History Center play in this whole removal of different plaques and statues and all the other things that are all going on?
So the Jacksonville History Center is not an advocacy organization unless you put it that we're advocating for history education and preservation where it's appropriate. And I'll speak more about the preservation role because I think we're going to talk a little bit about a few examples such as the Laura Trio project today. So our role is to make sure that people have a authentic and authoritative resource for information about the people and the events of the past. We do our best to keep up with the unfolding and changing interpretations of that. And part of the way that we do that is by inviting guest speakers to address audiences at our monthly speaker series, educational programming, by creating works, references that can be used for people to consult for information about the past. For example, last year we published a 2,000-copy edition of the 3rd volume of Jacksonville's Architectural Heritage, a book compiled by Wayne Wood, probably the preeminent architectural historian for this city and probably for a lot of other cities in the region as well, right? So those are references and resources that people can depend on and to be authoritative. That's our role, is public education. And there is enough work wrapped up in that to keep this organization busy for a long time to come. We conduct an oral history interview series, and in doing that, we let people know that their experiences matter. And an oral history project is something that oftentimes comes across as a little bit on the subjective side. But really, when you build up the depth of a collection over time, you really come up with a resource that can be just a tremendous asset to historians of the future. We archive and collect manuscripts, documents, minute books, corporate records, the correspondence of civic clubs, individual private collections of ephemera and artifacts. We have a photographic archive that's devoted just to Jacksonville that now is somewhere north of 100,000 images. We took over the photo collection of the Florida Times-Union when they had to relocate out of their longtime headquarters on Riverside Avenue. So those are the things that we do, and we make sure that that's available for scholarly researchers all over the world. We increasingly digitize those records, or at the very least make the information about their existence available so people know where to find what they're looking for.
Should the Historical Society take an active role in making a determination on whether or not a proposed monument would be either taken down or altered?
If it's on city property, we certainly would expect to and have had a voice in that. And I can give you an example.
Including the current issues?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah. And so
let me ask, pardon interrupt. What I'd like to know is, what is the difference between what the former mayor did when he took down the monument in Hemming Park and this mayor who did Women of the Southland? One, when Curry did it, nobody said anything. This one, all hell's broke loose. And both were on city property.
They certainly were.
Okay, so could you clarify the difference and why are we in this situation?
Well, I was about to discuss the incident of the statue in what's now known as James Weldon Johnson Park, formerly known as Hemming Park.
Correct.
And the monument, the statue or sculpture, was known as the Hemming sculpture. It was really meant to be an anonymous Confederate soldier.
Which was paid for by the Hemming family, if I'm not correct.
It was paid for by an individual, I believe his name was Charles Hemming, who donated it to the ownership of the state of Florida. And by the way, just to give you an example of how long this argument has been going on, our correspondence files and our records at the Jacksonville Historical Society on the subject of the so-called Hemming statue and the righteousness of its placement on public property. This argument goes back to the 1970s, and we have correspondence between city officials and the office of the then Secretary of State in Tallahassee seeking to clarify the actual ownership of the statue so that the argument could be placed at the doorstep of the right party, the steward of that statue. And the Secretary of State's office duly noted that it had been a gift to the state of Florida, but then they went on to observe that it's on city of Jacksonville property, and they effectively washed their hands of it and said, nope, it's not our statue. It's your problem. You figure out what to do with it. So the differences between the two are, Mike, really kind of difficult to comb out. I would observe that the statue that was placed in Hemming Park occurred in a somewhat different context than the one that was placed in what used to be known as Confederate Park, now Springfield Park. The Hemming statue placed in May of 1898 at a ceremony that was attended by, and this is really interesting, gray uniformed veterans of the Confederate military, retired non-serving veterans, and blue uniformed federal soldiers from active soldiers in the United States Army. How come? Because the U.S. Army was then staging through Jacksonville on its way to Cuba to fight in what came to be known as the Spanish-American War. And so the rhetoric of the speaker's program for that dedication in what was then St. James Park, shortly thereafter renamed Hemming Park, it was full of rhetoric about brotherly reunification. And isn't it wonderful that we can be in different uniforms, and yet here we all are gathered, for this dedication. And there was a lot of feel-good rhetoric about this is a good demonstration that we're burying the hatchet of the Civil War, which, mind you, was not all that long ago. In 1898, it would have been 33 years after the surrender at Appomattox. And in the big arc of history, 33 years is not that long ago.
I was going to say that's 1993.
Yeah.
When you think about it.
George H.W. Bush was still president up until then.
Yeah.
We almost got the Jaguars that year.
Yeah. So,
got it the next
for people of our generation, certainly not that long ago, there are now young adults who are voting age who weren't even born then. But my point is, it was still pretty fresh. The statue in what became known as Confederate Park, established in 1914, the context somewhat different, and it was not actually meant to memorialize combat, and nor would it have been appropriate for it to, because as we've already established, this wasn't the scene of Civil War combat. So this was faithful to a certain amount of nostalgic looking back and commemorating the cause of the Confederacy and the people whose lives were tragically affected. It also arrived in the context of a rising tide of violent crimes committed against African Americans in a harshly racially segregated region, the states of the former Confederacy, in which full citizenship still didn't obtain for African Americans, and they were subject to violent repression and lynchings. And we know of at least 6 separate incidents that took place in Duval County in the first decades of the 20th century during the years that this monument was placed in Confederate Park. So there are those who assert that the monument was placed there and meant to signal, by being put on public property, meant to signal an official recognition and approbation of white racial supremacy. I choose to believe that we cannot see into the hearts of people in the past necessarily. We do the best we can. But golly, it's hard enough to see into each other's hearts in the contemporary moment and really say to a certainty that we understand what people's most heartfelt and principled emotions and motives really are.
Or as my father used to say to me all the time, what the hell were you thinking?
Yeah. So it's not history's job
he
to
must be related to mine. So
it's not the job of history. It's not the job of history to blame or praise people from the past for what they did or did not do. It's history's job to understand and explain that, right? So I just did my best to explain and help people understand what the context of the moment was. But that context and that explanation, that's the work of historians. We know what happened. Do we know why it happened? Sometimes that's not quite so evident until time goes by and our impression and the context and all the rest of the information emerges, and we become more seasoned interpreters. And that, as I said at the beginning of this discussion, that's always changing, and is likely to always keep changing. So I would observe, too, that there has been some conversation about whether or not either of those two monuments and memorials was legitimately historic in the technical term. And I think what you're referring to, Mike Hightower, with that question is, were they historic landmarks? Is that what you were getting at? Officially?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that's what we keep saying is that, or when this piece of legislation that we may or may not get to, that's in Tallahassee, they keep talking about historical. Well, I'm trying to understand the context. What I've heard is those are two different issues.
Yeah, historical is a pretty imprecise term, and it's in the eye of the beholder. You kind of know it when you see it, right? But just because something old doesn't necessarily mean it's historical. And even if it is historical, does that necessarily mean that it deserves to be sustained in its original form and perpetuity in its original location? The city of Jacksonville has a process for determining that. So does the United States. We have a process that's administered by the Department of the Interior called the National Register of Historic Places. And buildings and sites get added to the National Register through a process that's set up in federal law and in the statutes of all 50 U.S. states and the territories. And it's administered in Florida by the Department of State. And the process really starts with the local county or municipality, moves through the Department of State, and eventually the Department of the Interior. We have properties, locations in Jacksonville that are on the National Register of Historic Places. But being listed on the National Register offers no protection from demolition or removal or really significant alteration. What does is local landmark status, which is something that is codified in the ordinances of the city of Jacksonville. And the custodian of that process is the Division of Historic Preservation Planning in the Community Development Department. As far as I'm aware, I'm not aware that either of those two statutes ever really was formally pushed through the process for local landmark designation. The process is actually 3 stages. Either the property owner, her or himself, nominates their property for landmark status, or the nomination process can emerge through the staff itself of the Historic Preservation Division. The Historic Preservation Commission would then vote on it. If they vote in the affirmative, then their decision goes to the Land Use and Zoning Committee of the City Council. They review and get another crack at it, and if their vote is in the affirmative, then the designation goes all the way to the full council with the endorsement of their LUZ committee. Did that ever happen with either of these statutes? I'm not aware of it. If it did, I'm unaware of it. But it's no surprise that it would be sort of an open question, because even I have to pick up the phone and call the staff at the Division of Historic Preservation Planning when a question comes up about a property, and I call and say, the property at, XYZ North Liberty Street, is it landmarked? And as often as not, the answer I get is, we'll have to look it up and we'll get back to you. These things come and go. And landmark designation itself, even if it has gone through the process and has been codified, it still is not an ironclad permanent, doesn't afford permanent protected status. And a good example of that is the Ford Motor Company plant that was demolished last year. That did have historic landmark status under the city of Jacksonville's ordinances. And so when the property owner wanted to demolish the plant, he showed up at permitting and said, I want a demolition permit. And they looked up the address and they matched it up to a list of landmark properties and said, sorry, you're going to have to get a certificate of appropriateness from the Historic Preservation Commission. So off he went. And unsurprisingly, the Historic Preservation Commission voted it down. Property owner hired a very skilled and resourceful government relations consulting firm, who then appealed the decision to the Land Use and Zoning Committee, and with the help of very persuasive conversations with key council members, the LUZ committee reversed the decision of the Historic Preservation Commission, and when it went to the full city council, the vote also was to reverse the lower finding and to issue a certificate to grant the demolition permit, despite the fact that the property had been landmarked. My point in saying all of this is that historic landmark preservation status comes and goes, it waxes and wanes, and the arguments for it change over time. I argued against demolishing the Ford Motor Company plant because I felt that it was, number one, it was an important aspect of telling Jacksonville's complicated 20th century business and industrial and seaport history. And also because I came to believe that it had a genuinely sustainable economic use in the 21st century. There are examples of other old Ford Motor Company plants that have been converted into wildly successful projects. Probably the most notable is in Richmond, California on San Francisco Bay. But I get it. Not every old property can be saved. Not every old property should be saved. And buildings were created to have an economically sustainable use when they were due. And if they can't be sustained a century later, then, it's legitimate to question whether or not they should be.
Which brings me then to the trio.
Okay.
Because we're talking about what could be demolished if we can't get this thing done.
That is what the developer said was the last comment that he made, was that if I don't get the funding, maybe I need to demolish it, which that's when it hit the fan.
Yeah, I didn't hear Mr. Atkins, the property owner, actually say that. I read about it. And of course, my phone and email lit up after that. And the same question everybody was asking, could he? And the short answer is not very easily, because he'd have to go through the certificate of appropriateness process that we just discussed. Yeah. Right. And at the meeting after which Mr. Atkins said what he said about possible demolition, before that, when the council meeting was in session, and I think there were, 17 of the 19 council members were in attendance that day. Maybe it was a little bit less than that, 15 or 16. But every one of them,
majority.
A strong majority, and every one of them in attendance said effectively the same thing, that they wanted to see the project preserved, that they wanted to see a historic renovation and adaptive reuse in the 21st century. So to suggest that a demolition permit would sail unimpeded through the process, I think is kind of a long shot at this point. I'm more worried about the forces of gravity taking over than I am.
That's what we've talked about.
Yeah, about economic demolition. So, and of course, one big difference between the Laura Trio project and the monuments that we're talking about is that the monuments are on city-owned property. They're on public parks. And the Ford Motor Company plant, the Laura Trio, they're privately owned. They're on private property. So there are issues of private property rights that apply here. And there also is a question of whether or not it's legitimate for public resources to be plowed into sustaining these uses and effectively propping them up. Does it matter enough to the people of Jacksonville that their resources should go into helping make a deal economically sustainable that otherwise is unsuccessful at attracting enough private capital to make it sustainable? That's the question, I think, that really is at the core of the city council's debate about this.
That's the policy issue.
Yeah.
Because of the unintended consequences or the precedent that it sets.
Well, it's not a completely random precedent. I mean, the city has a big toolbox. The Downtown Investment Authority has a lot of resources, and their governing board and their staff, its CEO Lori Boyer has become skillful at deploying those resources. It's just that the scope of the ask for the Laura Trio kind of is beyond the limits of what they have really been equipped to work with under the statute.
Can't let you go without asking you about the Jacksonville History Center. This is part of your 10-year plan, shall I say, that you want to get this campus built? Or?
Yeah, we really hope to get the campus, the building itself, completed within the next 3 or 4 fiscal quarters. So by the beginning of 2025, we have a 3-story factory building that we're renovating and adapting. It's 104 years old now this year. Wow. And so we're adapting that to 21st century use and making it sustainable as museum and exhibition space on the ground floor, a performance and event venue on the second floor, and a state-of-the-art archives on the third floor.
And where is it?
It is on our campus immediately west of the ViStar Veterans Memorial Arena. It's at 314 Palmetto Street, nestled on the scenic bank of Hogan's Creek, just north of the Maxwell House Coffee Plant and just west of the arena.
I'm assuming that you're accepting contributions to get this thing going and get it off the ground.
Boy, are we ever!
All right, would you tell people how to do that?
Yeah. What's the capital campaign? How big is it?
So for the building shell itself, it's about a $3.2 million project, and we have so far raised either cash in hand or reliably contracted and committed about $1.3 million. And with good prospects to drive home the rest of that campaign this year. So we're pulling the trigger and going on phase 1 of the project, which is what we can do with the cash and resources that we presently have on hand. And permitting in hand, all the approvals in hand, contractor lined up. And the rest of the project, then we're optimistic about driving home with the necessary funds to support. But, I've had really gratifying support from individuals and local foundations, philanthropic organizations. The city of Jacksonville has stepped up and been really helpful. All the current members of the city council really have been supportive about this. They recognize the need for public history and public history education. They recognize the public benefit of this for the city of Jacksonville. Our organization is the only one that serves the public history mission for all of the city of Jacksonville.
All right.
Wow.
With that brings to a close. We've gone a little long here today, but it certainly was worth it in my mind.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, so very much.
Thanks to you gentlemen so much for having me on and for being voices and advocates for Jacksonville's history. Can I just conclude by saying something about history? We often hear history being put into the service of arguments about contemporary issues, and people try to borrow from what we know about the past and say, history teaches us that we ought to do this or we ought to do that. And that's great. I mean, as I say, as a historian, I welcome that. But I do urge that people, when they're discussing historical interpretations, that they try to be effective with their argument by being factual and respectful of people with whom they disagree. And I think it's possible for us to do that. And it's particularly important in debates about history where understandings really can cross back and forth and conflict. So I advocate for civic discourse on this, and that's another one of the important identities of the Jacksonville History Center. That's what we do. That's what we strive to demonstrate by example.
We've picked the right person.
They
Thank
did.
you.
Thank you, Alan, very, very much. And thank you all for tuning into this week's Mike's on Mike. Nice to have you with us. We're very sorry that Mike Tolbert couldn't join us today, but I'm sure things will be all straightened out by next week. So he'll be back with us, and we'll be back to the three Mikes. Once again, you can find us on Facebook. You can find us on our website at mikesonmike.com. Look for us on podcasts. That's Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. Where else am I missing here? YouTube, and just about any other platform where you catch your favorite podcasts. We'll see you again next week. And once again, thanks for joining us.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Mike's on Mike with Mike Tolbert, Mike Hightower, and Mike Miller can be found on your favorite podcasting platform, Facebook, and YouTube. Visit the website at mikesonmike.com. Join us next time for more conversation with Mike's on Mike.